I greet you all in the name of our King, Lord, and our Savior, Jesus Christ. The topic that we are going to look at today is, what does Christian faith have to do with mental health? A few years ago, I was at a conference in Seattle, Washington, and needed to take a taxi to get to the airport. My flight was leaving at 11:30 p.m. It was pitch dark and I was alone. I found myself losing the courage to call an Uber or a Lyft and noticed my hands shaking and my heart racing. I realized that I was afraid to call them because I felt threatened by the thought of a male driver giving a ride to a woman passenger in the middle of the night. I have read horrifying stories of women being attacked by male drivers. The presence of that threat, based on past news, petrified me. Finally, I asked my husband and a couple of my friends to track the car that I was riding in, and as soon as the gentleman who dropped me off safely at the airport, I felt that my fear was lifted. My belief about Uber and Lyft drivers was built on the prior knowledge of a danger that I received from the news. Those stories are legit, but in my case, it should not have been such a threatening situation in my mind. Because of that fear, I was not ready to reach out and receive the help I needed from a person that I did not know. I shared this story because we approach any discussion on mental illness or mental health conversation in the same way. The first time we experience it, we think it is a threat based on our previous knowledge and perception. We do not want to talk about it because we are afraid. We say, what happens in this house stays in this house. What happens in this church stays in this church. We consider mental illness as a sign of weakness. Sometimes we even compare it to moral failure. We say we are not praying hard enough or that we do not have enough faith. We push the conversation about our emotional struggles to the corners of our houses or even out of our houses. We are afraid to deal with it. We are afraid of how others will see us. That lack of acknowledgement and suppression of the mental pain has pushed our generation into deeper pain and more severe mental struggles. If you have a loved one with a mental illness, or you yourself struggle with the symptoms of mental illness, your first reaction to such judgment from others may have been along the lines of sadness, helplessness, or anger. To make matters worse, the pandemic and the resulting economic recession have significantly impacted many people's mental health. According to a poll conducted in July, 53% of adults in the United States have reported that their mental health has been negatively impacted due to worry and stress over the coronavirus. In India, 10% of the population has common mental disorders, and 1.9% of the population suffers from severe mental disorders. Research conducted by the Suicide Prevention in India Foundation in May found that nearly 65% of the 159 mental health professionals who took part in that survey reported an increase in self-harm among their patients. Another survey in April by the Indian Psychiatric Society showed that about 40% of their participants were suffering from common mental health disorders such as anxiety and depression due to the pandemic. Even though India has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, the country and its people do not have a long history of discussing mental illness or mental health. The goal of this presentation and the ones that follow in the coming days and months is to flip that conversation on mental illness. We are going to learn to start conversations on mental illness and treatment strategies without fear or intimidation. We are going to openly talk about the real struggles and the pain of mental suffering. This is an urgent need in this age and time, and in this presentation, I would like to focus on why engaging in this mental health conversation is important. When we know why, we will be open to how or the ways of tackling the mental health challenges in our communities. May I begin with a brief study on a few terminologies or words we repeatedly use and at the same time repeatedly run away from. One is psychology. When we hear the word psychology, the issue of mental illness comes running into our minds. We immediately assume that it has some relationship with treating mental illness, and we tend to run away from it. Now, the word psychology comes from two Greek words, psyche, which means soul, and logos, which commonly means word and study or reason. So psychology means the study of the soul. Another word to keep in mind is psychopathology. This word has originated from three Greek words, psyche, which means soul, pathos means suffering, and logos means study. So psychopathology means soul suffering study. Another word to look at is psychotherapy. This consists of two Greek words, psyche, soul, and therapio, to heal. And psychotherapy means soul healing. So psychological or mental illness literally means soul suffering. Our soul, which consists of our minds, which includes the conscience, the will, and the emotions, can experience suffering. This suffering is caused by several factors. But before we look at these different factors, I want to bring a Christian framework here for our study. We Christians believe that God created the world, and He declared all of His creation, both the living creatures and the non-living things, as good. We see this theme in both the Old and the New Testaments in the Bible. And we also understand that we are fallen creatures. We are created in the image of God, but we are corrupted by the fall that happened in the Garden of Eden. And all aspects of who we are and what we experience in this life reflects this fallen condition. This means our physical, emotional, psychological, and cognitive aspects of our experience are in some way affected by the fall. Because of this reason, our physical conditions, our thoughts, our behaviors, and our decisions are never perfect while we live in this world. They are filled with weaknesses and limitations. The good news is God did not leave us in our fallen condition. He has not abandoned us in our fallen state. Rather, He stepped into our fallen world through the birth of Jesus and has offered redemption for the humanity's physical, emotional, psychological, relational, and spiritual problems. So we must view human mental health and well-being in the context of God's saving grace and His redemptive plan. Redemption through Jesus and the hope of resurrection tells us to never give up, and that God's grace is sufficient to cover all our limitations if we are in a right relationship with Him. Now, let us take a brief look at the factors that affect human mental health functioning. First, the depression, anxiety, panic attacks, or any other mental or behavioral health challenges can be due to a stressor or a stressful event like the pandemic we are facing today. When we do not have enough social support or other resources to lean on during a painful situation, we can slip into increased sadness and hopelessness. According to researchers, the soul suffering, whether it is short-term or long-term, can be caused by biological factors. This means the soul suffering or mental illness could be due to some physical issues. This can include medical illnesses such as hypothyroidism, diabetes, and heart disease, or accidents that led to traumatic brain injury, or other behavioral issues such as alcoholism or drug use in the family. The source of mental illness could also be psychological. This means our thought patterns such as hope, fears, expectations, and emotional responses to the events in our lives can affect how we perceive and continue to feel our feelings and think our thoughts. The third reason can be social influences. This explores the relationship patterns in our lives. How did our family affect our emotional well-being? For instance, growing up in a family with relational conflicts or alcoholic parents or other relatives affect a child's well-being. Also, the parenting strategies we take affect a child's mental functioning. The last but equally important part is spiritual influencers. This explores the question of how our faith experiences have shaped our emotional well-being. What do we believe about God? Do we have a healthy understanding of who God is? What do we believe about our relationship with Him? This leads us to a very crucial question. Can we separate spiritual problems from psychological, emotional, relational, and physical problems? Can we divide the spiritual world from the psychological or emotional? My answer is both yes and no. We as human beings are multi-dimensional. God created us as a unity of parts, much like Himself. Although we are image bearers of God, we are limited in our capacity to function alone. God created us to function in certain ways, and these functions include our internal thoughts, feelings, and the experience of our conscience. It also includes external behaviors and the ways we use to relate to others. To put it differently, we function physically, psychologically, socially, and spiritually. When we are not functioning properly, we place ourselves at risk of spiritual, emotional, and physical health concerns. All of these aspects are individual in nature, but are part of how we experience life and influence emotional patterns. As we experience painful symptoms of soul suffering, such as depression, anxiety, or suicidal ideation, we may realize that more than one area of our life needs attention. It could be due to a physical, psychological, social, spiritual, or a combination of these areas. To explain this further, our emotional well-being and our mental health are directly related to our physical health. Very few people are at their best psychologically when experiencing ill health or chronic pain or discomfort. The field of health psychology proposes that the state of one's body, mind, and spirit interact and impact each other. This means not only what happens to our body influences our minds, what happens to our minds impact our bodies as well. Current scientific research shows that people experiencing depression, anxiety, stress, and even post-traumatic stress disorders over a long period of time may experience certain physiological effects such as heart disease, diabetes, and even certain types of cancer such as ovarian cancer. The pain and suffering often lead us to God. And for some people, it leads them away from God. It depends on our understanding of the character of God and the emotional support we receive from our families and communities. This leads us to a crucial aspect that is involved in maintaining our psychological and our emotional health, and that is our relationships. We are not called to live a lonely life. We are called to live in communities. God has wired our brains to connect with others. As we see in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, God himself said that it is not good for us to be alone. Of course, our first and foremost need is to know God. But may we never underestimate the importance of being in fellowship with other believers. The Bible offers us advice and guidance on a variety of relationships, including marriage, parenting, siblings, and even with those who are not so friendly to us. When we have someone standing beside us that we can depend on, it makes us stronger, not weaker. Relationship is one of the reasons why Jesus gave us the church, so that we might be together and never be alone. There is convincing evidence in the scientific research that mental health is intricately linked to physical, relational, and spiritual health. With this understanding of mental illness as soul suffering, how do we as Christians respond to the suffering and the wounded souls in our families, our churches, and our communities? This calls us to action, doesn't it? In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 9 verse 35, when Jesus observed crowds of oppressed people, he was moved with compassion for them because of the many ways they suffered and because of their need for a shepherd. His response to people in pain, whether it is physical, mental, moral, or spiritual, is the perfect model for the church. Now, the question is, what can we do about it? How does the Christian community or a religious community can proactively and effectively respond to mental illness and emotional struggles? The church or the Christians are uniquely positioned to take a leading role in caring for those who struggle emotionally and psychologically. God's word explains the reality of suffering and the need for care and makes it clear that this is central to the mission of the church. In the letter to the church in Galatia, chapter 6, verse 2, Apostle Paul said, "Carry each other's burden, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." When we stigmatize mental illness, or when we avoid talking about mental illness, when we sweep under the rug the mental pain and the family problems and dysfunctional habits, and the effects of domestic violence and sexual abuse, when we label people who are suffering in their soul with insulting names, and when we look down upon them, we are doing the opposite of what we are commanded to do. We are not following the teachings of Christ. We are to be people of compassion who seek to comfort one another with the comfort that we have received from God. As a serving Christian, each of us lends a helping hand to carry the heavy emotional and psychological load with our brothers and sisters. The questions we must ask ourselves are our churches a safe place for the church members and others to share their mental health struggles? Do we hold a safe space for our brothers and sisters who are experiencing different kinds of soul suffering? Once a Christian researcher pointed out, the soul is the meeting point of the psychological and the spiritual. This means the modern psychological treatment, as well as the biblical or spiritual approaches such as prayer and spiritual encouragement, will touch the deepest levels of people's inner lives. What we need is a genuine love for people. May we develop a heart of empathy and understanding for the hurting people around us, in our families and in our communities. As a young girl, one of my favorite stories in the Bible was the powerful encounter between Prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Elijah was facing off 450 prophets of Baal in a contest set in opposition to the God of Israel against the Canaanite god Baal. This is a story with dramatic tension and a strong display of power. The story reaches its climax when the Lord answers Elijah with fire from heaven that not only consumes the sacrifice, but also licks up every last drop of water. The story ends with the destruction of the prophets of Baal by Elijah. What an exciting story. I still love the story, but not just because of the display of God's power here, but what was followed afterwards. Despite seeing the glory and power of God in such a dramatic way and winning a great victory, Elijah fell into what would today be described as depression. He ran to the wilderness and prayed to God to take his life, not once, but 2 times. We are probably shocked by Elijah's emotional response to Queen Jezebel's threats to kill him. After all, didn't we just see God's dramatic demonstration of power in consuming fire? We might expect a God who would criticize and blame Elijah for wanting to die, for his clear lack of faith, and for his despair. And yet, the story offers no rebuke, no stigma, and no criticism. Instead, an angel of God came to urge Elijah to eat bread and water, to be nourished because the journey was too great for him. There was no dramatic display from heaven to correct Elijah's depressed mood. But there was the presence of an angel, the nearness of God, and the nourishment for his soul to walk the road ahead of him. Like Elijah, there are days when we feel the mountaintop experiences, having received answered prayers and been victorious in daily battles, and we feel joyful and confident. But there are also days that despite seeing God's power and glory, we collapse under the weight of sadness and hopelessness. It is deeply encouraging to see that even in the place of valley and darkness of our soul, our God, our Father, draws near with gentleness. Isn't he the perfect model for us to care for the souls in our church and in our communities? May I conclude here with this? How does all this work together? The physical, psychological, spiritual, and relational. Our physical body interacts with stimuli and the individuals in the environment outside our minds and within our minds. The mind connected to the body through our brain is also in contact with our spirit. Our body senses and reacts to the external world, and our mind uses that information to understand and interpret our surroundings. The mind forms our thoughts and plans out our actions. Our spirit, when connected to God, works to transform our minds into the likeness of God. This interaction within our being helps us to engage in healthy relationships with others. So when we care for our soul, we must attend to both the spiritual and the psychological. We must consider the physical, relational, and emotional. We cannot counsel the spiritual without considering the psychological, and we cannot counsel the psychological without considering the spiritual. As Christians, we must be sensitive to the different needs of our people who are suffering in silence. We must do our part in breaking the barriers of the stigma of mental illness so that we can care for the suffering souls and fulfill the law of Christ. May our wonderful counselor comfort us as we model his compassion in our lives and in our interaction with our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. May the Lord bless us.